All right, I think that we can go ahead and get started. I know a few more people may trickle in, but that's okay. They'll just miss the ever exciting introduction piece of this workshop. So welcome everyone to this workshop with a fairly long title, How to Have a Way with Words and Numbers and Visuals. The numbers and visuals are the key parts of that title. That's mainly what we're going to be talking about today. We will be talking specifically about key best practices related to numbers and visuals when it comes to using those in your health materials, if you are creating health materials. But before we dive into all that, let me introduce myself. My name is Andrea Mongler, and I am a senior editor at a company called Communicate Health. And I'll tell you a little bit about Communicate Health in just a minute. But first, let me pass it over to my co-presenter to say hello.
Hi, everyone. I'm Janelle Hsu, and I am a senior methodologist and researcher at Communicate Health.
All right. Thank you, Janelle. You all will be hearing a lot from Janelle in the second half of today's workshop, and I'm handling the first half. So like we said, we work for Communicate Health. If you are not familiar with us, we are a health communication and research company serving a range of federal and state government clients, also nonprofit clients, and some for-profit clients. Two of our colleagues presented yesterday, Monica and Fred, so some of you may have been in on their workshop. A little bit more about Communicate Health. We like to say that we work at the intersection of plain language, health literacy, and human-centered design. And as you can see on the screen, our mission is to improve lives by designing health information, products, and digital tools that are easy to access, understand, and use. Basically, we are all about making sure people get the health information they need and can understand that information so they can make well-informed health decisions. And everything that Janelle and I are going to talk about today is central to that work that we do. So what are Janelle and I going to talk about today? Well, as I mentioned, we will be talking about best practices specifically related to using numbers and visuals in health materials. So how can we make sure people understand numbers, which are often hard to understand? And how can we use visual aids, so things like photos, graphics, etc., in a way that helps people understand health information? So our goal really is for you to leave today's session with some actionable knowledge that you can apply in your own work. So our three objectives then for today are that you will be able to identify best practices for using numbers in health materials, think critically about how to use visuals to help people understand health information, and then basically apply all that information to actually create clear health materials in your own work. I do also want to note up front that everything we are talking about today applies to health materials for like just about any audience, maybe all audiences, but these best practices are especially important for people with low health literacy skills, and we will talk about why in just a minute. And it occurred to me too, I should have mentioned at the beginning, logistics here, and I know you've been in other sessions, so you probably know all about the chat box. We will have time at the end for question and answers, but you are welcome to put questions in the chat. Janelle and I are helping each other monitor that, so we will do our best to answer questions. We will certainly have some interactive activities since this is a workshop. And at those points, you would also be welcome to, unmute yourself to discuss, or answer questions, things like that. That is totally encouraged and welcome. So, and to get us all kind of participating, let's start off with a reflect and share slide, as we've called it. So I would like to see if you would put in the chat box something that you are hoping to learn about during today's workshop. So maybe it's a question you have about using numbers in health materials or using visuals in health materials, anything at all. Okay, so I see presenting charts or graphs, how to best communicate a health message using visuals, statistics, which is relevant to numbers and visuals, really. New visual resources, interesting. Best use of visuals, best practices for presenting complex stats and numbers. Yeah, oh my gosh, so many things coming into the chat. I see things about communicating risk, efficacy. Yeah, best practices around visuals. Ooh, GIS. I don't know if we're going to get to that. Yeah. Spell out numbers 9 or 9. We'll talk about that. Don't worry. Yeah. So a lot of this, yeah, making info readable and interesting, drawings versus photos, what method resonates with readers, numbers or relative percentages, that's going to come up. A lot of this we are going to cover today. I'm excited to see all this popping up in the chat. If there are things we don't cover and you would like to talk about it, save your thoughts for the Q&A and we may be able to talk about it then. Or maybe follow up with us afterwards. So thank you everybody for sharing all that in the chat. So let's dive right in. I'm going to start with a couple of slides about health literacy just to set the stage and get us all on the same page. I do want to acknowledge that I know this is the Health Literacy in Action Conference, and I don't think that this is like the first time you have seen a health literacy definition or something like that. Again, I'm just kind of setting the stage. So our simple definition up here is that health literacy is how well people can find, understand, and use health information. And that's not like an official definition, like some of you may be familiar with the Healthy People 2030 definition, but it captures the important points and says, in plain language, what health literacy is. I should note, though, that I would actually describe this definition as personal health literacy. And it's also really important to point out that health literacy is not just about people's individual abilities, but about how well we, meaning the people who provide health information, how well we communicate with them to make that information easy to understand and use. And that component of it is called organizational health literacy. If we do that part well, personal health literacy improves too. So hopefully today you will come away with some actionable tips to help you write and communicate about health information. So one more health literacy slide here. We know that people with higher health literacy skills are more likely to make well-informed health decisions, and that people with lower health literacy skills often have a hard time doing that. And we put some examples on this slide of things that people with low health literacy skills may have trouble doing. So, understanding a vaccination chart, one of those big charts that I often see them for my kids, all the vaccines they need to get and what ages they need to get them and when they need boosters and all that stuff. Calculating the right dose of a medicine, or following directions for fasting before, a surgery or procedure or some sort of test. These particular examples are really relevant to today's workshop because they involve numbers or they could be accompanied by some sort of visual aid to make them easier to understand. I'd say a vaccination chart itself could be considered a visual. So how well you present that could really help people understand or not understand the information. Calculating a medicine dose obviously involves numbers, and probably so does the following directions for fasting. It's like no food or drink starting 12 hours before your surgery. And, maybe those directions could be made easier to understand with a visual. So throughout this workshop, we're going to talk about these types of examples and how you can use numbers and visuals in a way that helps people understand this kind of information and take these kinds of actions. And all of this matters to us because, of course, no surprise, as health communicators, it is our job to help people understand health information by communicating clearly. And the good news when it comes to numbers and visuals is that there are some established evidence-based practices for using numbers and using visual aids in health materials in a way that helps people understand them. However, there are also quite a few questions and unknowns related to using numbers and visuals in health materials. And that became especially apparent to us at Communicate Health a couple of years ago when we began working with the National Library of Medicine, or NLM, to help them develop a tool to assess consumer health materials to figure out which of those materials can be designated as easy to read, particularly for people with low health literacy skills. So basically, as we were doing that work with NLM and conducting that research to develop the tool, we really did notice that there is a need to provide clear guidance about including numbers and visuals in health materials. So ultimately, our goal through that work was to develop more nuanced and specific guidance to help people do just that, help people decide when and how to use numbers and visual aids. And so I point all that out because you're going to hear us refer to that research that we did with NLM a few times throughout today's presentation, because some of what we're talking about ties directly back to what we learned in that work. And actually what we're still learning in that work, because the visual aids component of that research is ongoing. And Janelle will tell you more about that in the second part of the presentation. All right, so let's jump in and talk about using numbers in health materials. So it's, I'm not surprising you probably by saying that numbers pop up all the time in different types of health materials and health information. So let's talk about some of those situations. Could you share in the slide, I'd like you to think of an example, more than one if you want, of the types of numbers you might see in a health material or health information. Lab results for sure. Yeah, prevalence of HIV or any disease within a population. Oh yeah, COVID is a good one right now. COVID testing positivity rates, risk, blood sugar levels. I could go for blood pressure, things like that. Percentages, BMI, and so many. Risk of recurrence. Yeah, I see lots of risk for sure. Numbers do come up in risk communication a lot, and risk communication is tricky. Yeah, medicines and dosages, amount of nutrients needed. That's a good one. Yeah, we think about, I even think about like reading a food label or something like that, and that's health related, right? I see lots of dosages, 9 out of 10. So there's a good one. You do definitely see that a lot. Sodium intake, so more food stuff. Yeah, lots. Thank you. I appreciate all these answers. So yes, those are lots of great examples. And I do want to point out that, some of these are times when like you need those numbers. Like if you are talking about, medication dosages, we can't just not include a number. You can't do that. Like, just take a little bit of medicine, guess how much medicine you need. Those are times when you need numbers. Some of these other examples though, for example, when we're talking about risk, do we need the number? Maybe we do, maybe we don't. We can talk a little bit more about that later. But I like that this is a variety of examples and that shows us that, yep, some of these are like vital. We have to include this in the information. Some of these, maybe not. So here is an example of health content that uses numbers in, I think, a pretty confusing way. This is from a government fact sheet. And the last sentence on there says, in recent years, it's estimated that between 70% and 85% of seasonal flu-related deaths in the United States occur among people 65 years and older, and between about 50% and 70% of seasonal flu-related hospitalizations have occurred among people in this age group. So let me just acknowledge first, that sentence doesn't follow a lot of other health literacy best practices like, plain language, things like that. It's way too many words. But we won't talk about all that right now. We're just going to talk about the numbers. And I will say this is a pretty typical example. You see this kind of thing all the time. That is 5 numbers packed into one sentence, which is a lot to take in. That can really, we want to talk about cognitive load. That's kind of a lot for people to remember, right, from the beginning to the end of that sentence. It's percentages, which can be confusing for people, and we will talk a little bit more about that too. And then there is the question of whether you need those numbers or whether you need all those numbers at all. Can you make those points without using the numbers? Maybe, maybe not. So key takeaway here, though, is that someone who has low numeracy skills may have a really hard time understanding this sentence. And quick definition of numeracy, since I just mentioned it, and you'll be seeing it on some other slides coming up. Numeracy is the ability to understand and use numbers. It's a real simple way to think of it, at least. So speaking of numeracy, so we just looked at that individual sentence that may be hard for people to understand, but can numbers in a health material affect someone's overall understanding of that health material? Answer is yes, absolutely. Numeracy, or again, the ability to understand and use numbers, is directly related to health literacy because someone with low numeracy skills is likely to have trouble understanding numbers in health materials. And if they have trouble understanding the numbers in a health material, there's a good chance that it will affect their overall understanding of that health material. So what do we do about this? Because again, sometimes we need numbers in health materials, right? We cannot always avoid including them. You all gave some great examples in the chat. or, you know, if you need to understand a blood pressure reading, or yeah, figure out a healthy portion size or something like that, right? So how do we help people understand those numbers? Well, to the best of our ability, we follow a set of best practices related to communicating with numbers. So let's talk about those now. Without further ado, I bring you 6 tips for using numbers in health materials. All right, so numeracy tip number 1, I'll give you a second to look at what's on the slide there. I could read it. We have the heart disease is the leading cause of death in the United States. The first version of that, we also put every year more than 600,000 people die of heart disease. We didn't do that in the second example. So this is all about our first tip, which is that you need to carefully consider whether numbers are useful before you include them in a health material. And we framed it this way on purpose, knowing that it may be different from what a lot of you have been taught. I'm guessing that you have learned or heard before that basically you should avoid including numbers in health information whenever possible. You know, of course, there are those times we've talked about when you need them, but just like avoid them if you don't need them. But actually, there is some nuance to that. Sometimes numbers can be very useful in situations where you may not absolutely need them, right? And when you're deciding whether to include a number in a health material, here's a key point: your communication goal matters. When I say communication goal, what I mean is the purpose of the health material. So what key takeaway do you want people to have after reading the material, or what action do you want them to take? So if numbers will help support your main message or your communication goal, it may be a good idea to include them. And I'm not saying go overboard and include lots of numbers, but maybe there is one particular number that would help you support your communication goal. So for example, if your communication goal is to catch people's attention and really raise awareness of an issue, a health topic, then maybe a number can help you do that. Let's consider this example on the screen. So this is a good example of what I'm talking about here. In our research, we found that when we showed people both versions of this heart disease content, the one with the number and the one without, most people noted that 600,000 people seemed quite big in relation to the US population. So if your communication goal is to drive home the point that heart disease affects a lot of people, including the number may actually be helpful and may really help you do that. So along the same lines, in that research, people consistently indicated that numbers lend credibility. So for example, we had some content that said, quitting smoking is one of the best things you can do for your health. If you smoke, your risk of lung cancer is much higher than someone who doesn't smoke. So yeah, we know that, and we also had a version that included an extra sentence that said, if you smoke, you're 15 to 30 times more likely to get lung cancer. And people strongly preferred that version with numbers. In the version that just said your risk is much higher, but did not include numbers, a lot of people actually expressed some sort of like doubt or a desire for more detailed information. Some of them indicated that they perceived that the statement might be an opinion, or they said it wasn't fact-based. So pretty interesting. So it's a lot to think about, but really the key takeaway here is just to carefully consider, could a number help me make the point I am trying to make? So would having such large numbers lead to behavior change though? Yeah, so that's a really good question. And I think that's where context comes into play, right? So we did test this, to caveat this, it was a small qualitative study and we were testing it with just these small bits of information. But ideally, in your health material, you're doing a lot more than this. You are talking about, here are the steps you can take to prevent heart disease, and to keep your heart healthy and things like that. So, I mean, I do think there's a lot of things you can do to, yes, still promote and lead to behavior change, but I absolutely understand your point. Did you just test the number? Yeah, so it was small bits of content, and I'm sure I totally understand your question, but we can talk more about that later too. So anyway, and I also want to caveat this tip before we move on, which is that I know this says do this, not that. And I think that's true for all the other tips, But this particular one, I'm not necessarily saying every time that you communicate about a disease, you have to include the number of people who die from it or the number of people who are affected by it. But again, instead, carefully consider whether doing that would help you achieve your communication goal. Okay, so our second tip is that when you do use numbers in a health material, you need to provide context. And I don't know, that may sound obvious to some of you, but there's maybe more to this than it sounds. One of the key points here is that context can come in the form of words or additional numbers, and we'll talk about that in a minute. So context in the form of words might be something like we saw in tip number 1, when we said heart disease is the leading cause of death in the United States. Every year, more than 600,000 people die of heart disease. We're putting the 600,000 in context by saying it's the leading cause of death. And that's the other point too. If you're including a number like that, 600,000 people die of heart disease every year, you also want to say it's the leading cause of death. Like, context with number is better than either of those things alone. And I think we saw that again and again. So I also said that context can come in the form of numbers. And I know that adding more numbers as context may seem counterintuitive, but it can be helpful. And one of the main things we're talking about here are ranges. Ranges in particular can be a really helpful way to provide context. And I'm actually going to play an audio clip for you here, and hoping you can all hear it okay. But this is a participant from the research that I've been talking about. And this participant was talking about the content you see here on your slide, where we're saying your triglyceride level was 350. The bottom version just said that's considered unhealthy. The top version says that anything in this range is considered unhealthy. So let's see what he says.
It's telling you the range, and not just saying your level was. It's telling you the range. Mm-hmm. Healthy. That way you can see how close you are in the range.
Yeah, so he talked a lot about the range, and at least in our study, giving people a range really helped them make meaning of a number. When we did not give them a range for this particular triglyceride content, they almost always asked for one. And I see some questions. So how many people would know what triglyceride is? Another fair point. And again, you're just seeing a small bit of content. This would be in context in the material, right? If you are following other health literacy best practices, you are explaining to people what their triglyceride level is, why it matters to their health, right? Explaining all that before you are doing this, right? And now, granted, this is kind of a strange one because it's like, in this case, it's like, I don't know, is the doctor just telling them it's 350? But if you are presenting this information, you are giving them all that information they need to understand triglyceride first, then you're giving them their level and putting it in context so they can see where it falls in that range and understand that they are just right smack in the middle of that unhealthy range. So would there be a risk that they might think that higher than 499 is okay? And that's a fair point too. And maybe that's an example where you need to add a little bit more context to actually explain that, anything above this is more unhealthy, anything below this is healthier, that kind of thing. So you might need a little additional context there. And no, we did not. That Jenny asked the question, did you test people whose primary language was other than English? This was just English speakers. However, we would love to do that kind of research if we get that opportunity. But yeah, great question. So key takeaway for this tip is that providing context is key to helping people understand health information. Okay, so our next tip is that when you can, it's a good idea to use visual metaphors to help people understand numbers. So like you see on your screen, instead of just saying a serving of cheese is 1 ounce, also say something like, or about the same size as 4 dice. And I will tell you, these food metaphors are like plentiful. If you ever have to write about a serving size, you can look up online. You can probably find a good visual metaphor. You don't have to come up with that on your own. So you can probably understand though why this is helpful. If you are like me, you have no idea what 1 ounce of cheese looks like without some sort of visual metaphor like that. And that is because people, me included, make sense of numbers through visualization. In our study, we found that when we did not provide a visual metaphor, people often created their own visual in their minds to help them understand numbers. Now, whether their own visual was accurate or not is another question, right? It may not have been. So if we can help people do that, if we can help people visualize something that's, the right amount or the right size, we are really ultimately helping them understand that number and understand the health material. It is, of course, important to try to choose metaphors that are familiar to your audience. I don't know if that sounds obvious. I think the one on this slide, yeah, exactly. I think Elizabeth said what I was just thinking of. So the one on this slide, I think is a pretty good example because the large majority of people know how big dice are. Here's an example I came across that is probably not good to use, especially depending on your audience's age. One serving of bread is about the same size as a cassette tape. So if you have younger people in your audience, they may not know how big a cassette tape is. So that may be a terrible visual metaphor. I do want to note also one more thing, which is that visual metaphors are not the same thing as visual aids, which we'll talk about later. But you could also use a visual aid for the example on this slide. So that would be like, okay, you say one serving of cheese is 1 ounce or about the same size as 4 dice. You could actually show a picture of 4 dice and then show cheese that is that size. That would be really helpful. I think that would be ideal if you're showing people that, right? But if you couldn't do that for some reason, space reasons or whatever, this visual metaphor would be particularly helpful. So yeah, that's not enough bread. Yeah, so the Noun Project is a great free resource for helping with nutrition visuals. That's awesome. So yeah, I thank you. I see some great things going on in the chat. Thank you everyone for contributing. I see it. In our experience, we've had to avoid use of visual comparisons for size estimate as these examples are not understood across cultures. And that is also a fair point. And that is something that, we will always put a plug in for testing your materials with your intended audience or your primary audience. Make sure they understand all the information in your material, including things like visual metaphors. And if you can't test your materials, right, you always need to think about that. Obviously, the primary language of your audience and their cultural considerations and things like that. So I'm not saying take the task of choosing a visual metaphor lightly. There's a lot to think about when you're doing that. All right, so our fourth tip is pretty straightforward, and someone asked about it early on. So, and that is to use numerals instead of the spelled out versions of words. We have found that when we have numerals in health materials, people say that those stand out in the text, and in a good way, not like they stand out, people aren't stumbling over them or something. We've had people note that those numerals will cause them to actually slow down and reflect on a statement. And the other thing that people will note is that numerals will draw their eye. But if there's a spelled out number, so like in this example, the 20 on the bottom rather than the numeral 20 on the top, if there's that spelled out number, people may basically like read right past it without really taking it in. So if you have a number that is important to your main message, or is a point that you really need to make to your audience, you want it to stand out to them, you don't want people to miss it, right? So using a numeral is a good idea in that case. There are also other things you can do if you want something to stand out to people, bolding the sentence, things like that. But this is definitely a plug for using numerals. I will also note that this best practice does apply to ordinals, we have found. I know some of us were maybe taught to spell out ordinals. And when I say ordinals, I mean like second or third. So like I'm saying 2ND, like second trimester or whatever, rather than spelling out second, SECOND. Yeah, so all pretty straightforward there, I think. I see some other questions. Some clinicians prefer not to use absolutes, like you are more likely, maybe more likely. That is a good question. Have we had experience using maybe as opposed to are in statements such as 2 times more likely? Yeah, I mean, I think some of that depends on, again, your communication goal. Like if we feel that is an accurate statement to say are, rather than maybe. I think we would be fine doing that, but this is also a plug for not only testing materials with your audience, but also, if you do have subject matter experts reviewing your materials and there is a reason that they feel more comfortable with that maybe wording, I would do that. But I mean, I also think we want to be as accurate as possible. And if, doing X makes you 2 times more likely than someone who doesn't do X, to whatever, get a disease or something, like I think it's better to be as clear as possible about that rather than the maybe kind of wording. Good resource for testing your materials with your intended patient population. Yeah, so we have a slide at the end that's going to have some tips for that. And we will think on that in the background if we have anything that we can chat out to you that would be a resource you can look at for that. So good question. Okay. All right, and so this is a quote from one of our research participants talking about why they preferred to see numerals as opposed to spelled out versions of numbers. So this participant said, in your mind, it's just easier to read if you go through numbers. People sometimes speed read certain things, certain words, and you can skip it that way. But with a number, it's easier. So what they were basically saying is that point I was trying to make, that people might just like read right past a number that is a spelled out version rather than a numeral. So anyway, and people sure do speed read certain things. I know when you write the material, you wish they wouldn't, but they do. And so we need to do what we can to make sure they take in the important points. All right, our 5th tip is to use simple numbers. But what does that mean, really? For one thing, it means using whole numbers instead of things like decimals and fractions. I do understand that there are times when you can't, for some reason, you have to be as specific as possible. But whenever possible, if you can avoid things like decimals and fractions, definitely do that. Rounding is generally okay. Like on this example here, if I were going with the percent, that 8.3, I'm going to say 8. I'm not going to say 8.3. Simple numbers probably also means using frequencies instead of percentages. I think someone may have asked about this at the beginning. That said, in our research, we have found that it's actually not super clear that people overall really do understand frequencies better than percentages, but it is generally understood to be the case. And that's what you'll see in established guidance, that frequencies are better than percentages. There are some nuances to this, and I don't think we're going to get into this now, that it may matter what the frequency is or what the percentage is, like, is 1 in 10, like easier than a 1 in 7 or something like that. And our kind of round number percentages easier for people than a harder frequency maybe. So again, it's not real clear cut, so we won't get into all that today, but I think the big takeaway is that frequencies are probably better. Also, I should note that frequencies can serve as kind of a visual metaphor for people. We talked about visual metaphors earlier. We have found that when we give people a frequency, they will say things about their visualizing their family or people in a room and considering how many of them could be affected. So if we say like 1 in 4 people have, X condition, someone who has a family of 4 might picture their family and think like, oh, that's like one of the people in my family. All right, final numeracy tip is really straightforward. If you can help it, never make people do math. Instead, do the math for them. So oftentimes this looks like providing some sort of chart along the lines of what you see on your screen here. And this is because not only can math be hard for a lot of people, but asking people to do calculations could even be a safety risk in some situations. The content on this slide is a good example of that. If you are giving your child medicine or yourself or your parent, whatever, it's really important to get the specific amount right. In the example on the right, we're asking people to do that calculation themselves. And while that might be simple math for some people, it might be very hard for others. And we don't ever want to assume that people can do a certain level of math. So don't make your audience do it if at all possible. And so when we're doing this, we're making it easy for people and also probably lowering the risk of someone making a medication error. So let's do a quick recap and then we will dive into our first activity of today's workshop. So again, carefully consider whether numbers are useful, whether they can help support your communication goal or main message. If they can, you may want to include them. If they can't, you probably don't. Provide context, which can be words or additional numbers like a range. Use visual metaphors to help people understand numbers. Use numerals instead of spelling out the words. Use simple numbers. And again, do the math. Don't make people do calculations. All right, so here is our activity. Oh, and I see a question real quick before we do this. Are you noticing any number fatigue given the pandemic? I mean, yeah, and that's a whole other discussion too, but yes, things like, people talk about, COVID numbers and like positivity rate and all that stuff, not just number fatigue, I think in our audiences, but also the people that are trying to communicate those numbers in plain language, because also we've had to learn a lot about what all those things mean and how many numbers people need to know and what matters and what doesn't. So that's a whole other story. Would you consider using some kind of comparison to give a sense of proportion? Yes, I think so. I think that might be a good strategy. Okay, so chat out the link. I'm going to chat out if I can get it copied, a link to a shared folder that has 2 handouts in it. You're going to want the numeracy one right now. I think these are also available maybe on the conference website, so you may have already seen these, but it's the one labeled numeracy or numbers, something like that. Once you open that, you will see the numeracy tips that we just discussed, followed by 6 short health-related blurbs, I'll call them. So what we're going to have you do is revise each of those blurbs so that they better align with the numeracy tips that we just discussed. I'm guessing that you'll find that a few of these are super straightforward and a couple may require a little more thought and effort. What we're going to do in just a minute is actually send you to breakout rooms to do this with, I think, probably 2 other people. We're going to try to have 3 people in a breakout room so that you can work on this activity as a group. How you do that is up to you. You can choose to discuss each one together, or maybe you divide and conquer, like you each take 3 of the blurbs and then discuss with your group. We are going to give you 10 minutes to work on this, and then we will bring everyone back to the big group to discuss what changes you made and why. If you run out of time and don't finish all 6, that is totally fine. Just do what you can. So I haven't seen any questions related to the activity in the chat. So I'm thinking everyone is okay. So in the interest of time, I think a link is not working. Is anyone else having trouble with the link? Let's find that out before we move on. Interesting. It's supposed to be a shared link. So some people got it fine. Interesting. Some did and some didn't. Okay, so, and I don't know if someone can put in the chat, one of our IHA people, how people can access this handout on the conference site if they're not able to use our link. It looks like most people can, but some people have had trouble. Okay, there we go. There it is in the link. So I think you should all be okay. Click on the link in the chat now. There we go. And Anna chatted it too. So now that I think everybody can probably access it, the numeracy one, let's go ahead and send you to breakout rooms, and we'll see you back here in 10 minutes. And actually, while people are trickling back in, I am going to put in the chat. Oh, I think everybody's back. Okay, before we discuss the activity, one quick thing. Someone had asked a question about tips for audience testing, and we have a couple of links that I'm going to share in the chat right now that may be helpful for you. So definitely both free. Oh, hold on, I'm having trouble copying the second link. Here it comes. All right, so you should be able to now see on my screen the handout that you all just worked on. So we'll go through this, I think, pretty quickly. I don't think it'll take too long. We may have discussion on some of them, but I think what we will do is let's have someone, doesn't have to be all 138 of you or whatever, but if you feel so inclined, let's start with number one. Throughout most of your pregnancy, you'll see your doctor for checkups every month. Your doctor may ask you to come in more often in the third trimester of your pregnancy. You want to copy into the chat what you did with that content to make it align with the numeracy best practices. Oh, interesting. So someone switched the order of things a little bit. So I'd be interested to talk about that, but in the interest of time, we may not do that. So I see changing third to the 3RD, and that is what I was going for there. I also see the last 3 months of your pregnancy. Interesting. So this goes back to our context. If we might have an audience who doesn't know what trimesters are, we may need to describe that. And the last 3 months of your pregnancy seems like a good way to do that. I like that. At week 27, I can also see that depending on, again, some of this is the context of what people know and what your material is. So I see some really great ideas in here that I would love to talk more to some of you about and what you were thinking with these. But yeah, the big thing here is changing that third to the 3RD. If you are leaving third, because that numeral is going to stand out more to people. And we've seen that numerals are better than spelling out words. So yeah, lots of great ideas in here. And yeah, again, the more often we would certainly get into that more if this were the full material. All right, lung cancer is the second leading cause of death in the United States. What did you all do with that? Yeah, X number of, people die of lung cancer each year. Oh man, and I have a different number of deaths. Did I get the number of deaths wrong? Yeah, but number of people who are died. So I'll put in the chat what I did here, which is, yes. And again, this would be, I'm not saying you always have to put the number in something like this, but like we talked about earlier, this may really, help you with your communication goal if you're really trying to raise awareness about how important this is, and people are going to see that as a big number. So that's really something to consider. All right, breathing in too much pollution can be dangerous for people with asthma. If you have asthma, the air quality index can help you stay safe by telling you when the air may be dangerous for you to breathe. Today, the AQI is at 25. So I'm curious to see what some of you might do for this. Air pollution, yeah, an AQI of blank is dangerous. Today's level is 25. I see people trying to put a range in there. Drop the first sentence. I can see that, but yeah, so I'm not going to copy in the whole, well, you know what? I will copy in the whole thing. This is what we did, where we added, and this gets at what someone talked about earlier with triglyceride, like, will people get confused if higher is better or lower is better? So we spelled it out really clearly here. The AQI ranges from 0, safest, to 500, most dangerous. Today it's 25. That means the air is safe. So you can really see where in the range you fall. Okay, in the interest of time, I don't want to shortchange Janelle and the visual part. I'm going to maybe quickly go through the last ones. A healthy serving size of peanut butter is about 2 tablespoons. Here's what I did with this one. Feel free to put in the chat if you came up with another cool visual metaphor for a healthy serving size of peanut butter. I'd love to see it. Researchers found that 91.4% of people who took the medicine got better. This is probably a thumb pad, about the same size as a thumb pad. Interesting. Golf ball size is probably good. Researchers found that 9 out of 10 people who took the new medicine got better. Probably that's going to be easier for people to understand. And then the last one, the doctor will prescribe amoxicillin for your child's strep throat. That means your child will either take a 50 milligram per kilogram dose once a day, blah, blah, blah. This is what we did. Chat it for you. Yeah, and I like the 90% hope. Yeah, that's definitely better than the 91.4 or whatever that is. And probably 90% is not too hard for people to understand. Again, we don't want to assume that though. Your child will need to take the medicine once or twice a day for 10 days. I don't think you need the doses. That's too many numbers. They'll find that kind of information out when they are prescribed the medicine and get it. If we're just telling people about strep throat and how it's treated and what they should expect, they just need to know that the doctor's going to prescribe medicine and their child is going to take it for 10 days. We could talk more about whether we need those numbers at all. Oh, interesting, Amy. Yeah, that's visually easier for people to understand too, if you are going to include those numbers and you put it like in columns like that. All right, so thank you. And sorry, I know I kind of flew through that last part, but I want to make sure Janelle has, yes, we can send the revised content of what we did. I can absolutely send that. Thank you, Tanya. I'm going to pause, stop sharing my screen because it is Janelle's turn now to talk about visuals, and I want to make sure we have time for that.
Hey, everyone. I have so enjoyed listening to Andrea. I'm always amazed at how many new thoughts I have, how many additional insights I have, no matter how long and often we talk about health literacy. So I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation. Can everyone see this? Perfect. So I am not quite as talented as Andrea in watching multiple screens at the same time. So she is going to interrupt occasionally just to put some of your questions into my ear, and then we can talk about them as we go. So I do want to be mindful of time. I know our session ends in about half hour. So I imagine there will be some things relating to using visual aids in health materials that we might not get to, but I'm really looking forward to sharing some of the tips and insights that we have had through our work. Alrighty. So the first thing I want to talk about is really health literacy and visuals. It's really important to think about how those two things interact, what the relationship is between them, and also to remember that they are not the same thing. And unlike numeracy and health literacy, where they're kind of parallel, like numeracy is the understanding of numbers, and health literacy is the understanding and use of health information, very generally there. Visuals are actually intended to be a way to help address some of the struggles that people with limited health literacy encounter. So first of all, I would like to go ahead and just give you a minute or two to share out, using the chat box here in Zoom, just some of the examples of different visuals that you might see in the health material. It could be you talking about different types of visuals, or links to some visuals if you know of any that you really like or that are really good case studies of what not to do. Okay, I do see some things that we're having here, and I really love what we're talking about in terms of diagrams, especially of anatomy. We've already talked about nutrition labels. There's a lot of overlap for some visuals and numeracy. Infographics, which I think is a really fantastic item that is really complex and something we'll be chatting about more later. Picture of a knee brace your doctor tells you to wear. I love that, how your doctor tells you to wear it, because we all know that not all of us do exactly what the doctor says. Graphs, food that you should eat with a big, not eat with a big X on it, anatomy drawings to show where cancer is, real photos, all sorts of really fantastic examples that, that you're talking about here. I'm going to show you a couple examples that we have here. And one of the neat things about visuals is they're kind of endless in terms of shape, style, and what they talk about. So one of these is from the Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry, ATSDR. That's part of the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. But the one on the left is basically to help people understand what what sound levels are safe and which ones are more dangerous. So the one on the right, actually, it's from the Clear Communication Index User Guide. That's a CDC resource. This one shows the different steps of a process that is described using text. And you can imagine that you can think you're understanding what the words are saying, but seeing those actions displayed could actually help you to put that guidance into place, into practice. So one of the things that we really want to talk about here is that visual aids are intended to be one way to help people, especially people with limited health literacy, to more easily understand health information and to use that information. So visuals in health material. Visual and visualization comes into play in a variety of ways when you are talking about designing for health literacy. One of the first things that many of you are probably familiar with is visual cues. Andrea alluded to this earlier. This can include things like bolding, things like bullet points. The second thing is data visualization. Infographics come in here, charts, graphs. And then there are other types of visual aids. Maybe process flows can fall into here, although that can be considered a type of chart. But it's one of those things that doesn't fall into those other categories and could include things as simple as a photograph. When we think about how visuals actually affect understanding, something that's important to remember is that in the best case scenario, yeah. Sorry, I thought somebody had a question. I think that might have been an audio fluke there. So visual aids, when visual aids are well designed, when they fit the materials, they can make materials appear easier to read. So we know that sometimes looking at a page of nothing but text can feel intimidating and actually make it more difficult for and less likely for people with limited health literacy to engage with that material. It can reinforce the main message. This is really important in terms of it can actually help convey the information that is most important for the reader to take away from the material. And it can help people remember the information. That is something that we started doing just this past week or so, doing data collection for another study for the National Library of Medicine. And one of the participants said something along the lines of, seeing that picture when I look at the handout again at my house would help me remember, oh, that's the one that tells me what to do about lead poisoning. And it is a way that kind of helps people queue up the information in their brain to recall what they remember from that particular handout. So one of the things we really have to think about before we get into tips for using visual aids is the fact that sometimes visual aids do not actually work to, I'll go back a slide, to do what we want them to do. Whether a visual aid actually does make materials easier to read, whether it reinforces the main message, whether it helps people remember information, depends upon, first of all, picking the right visual for a health material. There needs to be a match there. For example, you can imagine if I had a picture of a tree and I was talking about COVID-19, that could be a little confusing. Sure, it might make it look prettier, but it would be a stretch to try and explain how that actually helps. But then there's also when we have the best of intentions and we really are thoughtful about what visual we're choosing, about how to make sure the visual actually isn't creating additional confusion, if it isn't actually working against our intention. There is a construct called visual literacy. And in essence, basically, it's the idea that people have a set of skills that help them to make meaning and interpret information, use that information when it is conveyed in an image or other graphic representation. And so some people have great visual literacy and other people less so. And it is likely, although there's not a direct correlation, it's likely that people with limited health literacy skills may also have limited visual literacy skills. I'll be talking about this a little bit later when we're talking about tips, but it's important to remember that visual literacy is really context specific and culturally specific. For example, if we are talking about people in the United States, they may have certain visual understandings that are common here that might not be common in another country. So one thing we always have to think about is really taking a step back and trying to think about our visuals in relation to the health materials to figure out if we're using one that is helpful or if it is actually creating a different set of problems or adding to confusion. Okay, so I am going to talk about 8 different tips for using visual aids in health materials. And I call these tips because to a certain extent, the body of quote unquote best practices around visual aids, especially data visualization, is really under development now. There's a lot of great research that's going on. I know Jessica Anker, she is at Vanderbilt now. She and the folks at the University of Michigan are doing some really great work around guidelines for what visual to use when, especially when we're talking about data visualization. But we wanted to say, okay, there's a lot that is still being sorted out. There's a lot that is really specific to your audience and to the purpose of your materials. But there are some general tips that can help you figure out how to make the visual aid work for the material and for your audience. So here's my first one, which is choose visuals that support the main message. So support the main message. I want to take a second here to really think about what that means. First of all, just so we're on the same page, when I say main message here, I mean the most important thing for your audience to take away from the health materials. And then we really have to think about what support means. And that can vary. It can mean reiterating the main message to reinforce it, or perhaps it can mean helping the audience identify that, hey, this information is for people like me. It could help to set the tone that makes the main message really resonate or sink in. Maybe it helps to alleviate some of the anxiety or fear that could prevent the message from resonating. Or it could, as in the example here, it can actually help to illustrate some of the details that are essential for that main message. In this case, imagine that we have a health material that is really trying to send home the message that the amount that you eat is as important as what you eat. And so portion control is going to be a big part of that. The visual on the left really talks about size matters in food portions. And as Andrea was saying, I think very few of us can look at something and tell you how many ounces it is, especially when it comes to food. I think the research shows we typically grossly underestimate, especially here in the United States, where we're used to very large portion sizes when we buy food at restaurants. But what this visual does is it helps to provide reference points. So 1 cup is about the same size as a baseball. 3 ounces is about the same size as a deck of playing cards. And 1 ounce is about the same size as a CD. The image on the right would actually, it's consistent with eating healthy, but, and it's a very visually appealing image. I think we can easily see health materials using an image like this, but you can see that it could be confusing to people when they're trying to figure out how much of something, since there are so many apples. We know that in general, eating a lot of fruit doesn't tend to be bad for you, but we also know there are some healthy foods that still need to be eaten in moderation.
Janelle, can I jump in with a question from the chat for you real quick? So we have a couple questions about why not use the actual images of food? Like, why are we showing, a baseball or cards or whatever, instead of just like showing the food?
Yeah, and I think part of that has to do with helping people to put it in context of things that are familiar to them. And they may or may not actually be familiar with the food that you're talking about. Some of it is they may take food images more literally. And this is a really good way that's portable. For example, if people are going to the grocery store and they're reading about ounces, they can start to remember in their head as a visual metaphor, similar to what Andrea was talking about earlier. So it's a kind of portable reference point. But I do want to go back to the CD. I see people talking here about the CD, and I agree that that particular one, there may be issues with all 3 of them. You really need to know your audience here, but that particular one seems to be outdated. If I ask the kids in my life what a CD looks like, I'm not sure that they could 100% tell me, accurately describe it. You are asking so many great questions here. I see things about liquid portions. I think, again, you would need to pick the right reference point for that visual portion. Because the weight can actually vary, liquid versus solids. So you would want to choose something that that accurately conveys that information. There's so much that we could talk about here. And I see great things about fist, finger, et cetera, to be effective portion sizes. There's could be things along those lines that are more universal, but also we have to bear in mind whose thumb, whose finger, whose fist. I happen to have really long fingers, so I would get to eat more than other people. So let me go ahead and move on to tip number 2. So in this case, it's about choosing a visual that represents the audience. And this is really important because we all know people tend to pay attention to information that seems relevant to them. And one way to do that is to depict your audience in the health materials. So it can be a really good idea to do that. If you're going to include people in your visuals, it's really important that they represent your audience that you are in particular trying to speak to. This is why health materials, we tend to figure out who our primary audience is, even if it may be also applicable to people in general. And then you would choose images that represent that audience. I want to show you an example here is from material that we worked on, Communicate Health worked on with MITRE, that was part of a storybook used to convey information about the COVID vaccine to people with intellectual and developmental delays and challenges. And there are two things I want to point out here. I saw some questions earlier about cartoon versus pictures. And in this case, the cartoon storybook way of representing information here was specifically chosen because that really resonates with a lot of people with IDD. And then the characters here were actually inspired from pictures of people who actually have IDD, so that it looks, the people here are pictured in a way that resonates with them and are designed to look like people who that they might look like or their friends might look like. In terms of whether there is official guidance in terms of the picture versus cartoon, it really depends on tone and it depends on who your audience is. There are benefits either way. You can have a more generic character if that's something you're concerned about, with perhaps line images. But it's also, you need to think about what really is going to make the most sense for your particular audience. So the image on the right, that's a perfectly fine picture, but for this particular deliverable, it wouldn't have seemed as appropriate to make sure that people with, in this case, real challenges in terms of health literacy to get the information they need. Visual aid tip number 3, use realistic visual aids. Use realistic visuals. This is something that I think is going to become increasingly challenging because I don't know about you, but I am starting to get used to seeing symbols with no words attached to them. It feels like, especially technological interfaces, really there seems to be a move to not needing words, and that's great in some ways. But we always have to bear in mind that just because I understand something, just because some people seem to intuitively understand a symbol, doesn't mean that everybody will, and doesn't mean that it's the best practice. So in this particular case, both of these images are pretty simple. They're pretty straightforward. There's nothing humorous about them per se. But what the visual on the left does is it actually conveys sneezing, whereas the one on the right might suggest sneezing, but it's a box of tissues, right? So the images, you want them to be realistic and not symbolic. The other thing that you don't want to do is to, when you're using drawn or non-photographic images, is to make sure that you're including things for people like eyes, ears, nose, mouth. We don't have a nose here, but enough to convey this is a real person, right? This is meant to depict a real person. If you have somebody with no facial features, that can be distracting perhaps, or it could be confusing to people. I want to go ahead and pause here because there are so many questions coming in. Does anybody have any questions thus far about the first 3 tips? Supporting the main message, representing your audience, and using realistic visuals. I think that's a fantastic question about whether we should, with intent, include diverse audiences within our target audience, our priority audience. And I think that it really comes down to your communication goals and your objectives from these perspective of health equity. Absolutely, that makes a lot of sense. If you were trying to communicate with people for whom that could be counterproductive, you may want to think about the degree to which you do that. And one great way to do that is to really have multiple pictures. We're doing testing right now, and one of the topics has to do with HIV. And a number of participants have talked about how they don't want just one image of a gay couple because they feel that could be stereotyping. It could feel like it excludes some people, but also it could be confusing to people who may actually think that only gay people can actually get HIV, be HIV positive. So you're asking a lot of great questions, and it's all about kind of balancing out and finding the best way to achieve your different communication goals. Oh my gosh, I'm seeing this comment about diversity in stock pictures. Yes, it's very hard sometimes to find good images with proper health practices that have diverse audiences. So anything I think we can do as an industry to help with that, I think makes a lot of sense. I'm looking at the time here. We have, I can't believe it, but we have about 10 minutes, if that's correct. I want to go ahead and talk about the next 5. There are 8 visual aids. Tips here. One is to use a consistent visual style. So let's look at the one on the left. What we have here are 3 steps, if you will, or 3 actions, and they each use the same character. And what that does is it reduces cognitive load. In other words, how much your brain, how much work your brain needs to put into it to actually understand the message. So with the same character, with the same visual style, we're able to kind of say, okay, these are 3 things that if I were that person, could do. Eat a healthy diet, get 8 hours of sleep, get active. On the right, you have the same 3 actions, steps that I can take, but you see that I can't say the styles are inconsistent with each other, but they're different enough that perhaps you'll get distracted by that if you're the reader. Somebody in your audience might, and actually get distracted and focus more on the design of the visual rather than the message it's trying to convey. So anything that you can do to help your audience, especially someone with limited health literacy skills, to get to the key takeaway, the main message with as little work as possible, that's the goal. Number 5, keep visuals simple. I referred to this a little bit earlier. On the left, we have a person figure, I'll call them that, who looks to be covering the lower part of their face with their arm. And on the right, what you have are a variety of actions that our little person figure is trying to do all together. So I'm looking at this, and on the left, just looking at the figure, I can kind of get the idea, and then I can go down to the words and say, cover your mouth and nose with a tissue or sleeve when coughing or sneezing, and discard used tissues. On the right, what we have are avoid contact with people who have a fever, cold, and influenza. And it's only once I use the words that I can start to figure out what the people figures are conveying. On one side, you have a person who's kind of standing by themselves, and then the other, it looks like somebody is shivering from a fever and has a cold. So it looks like a do this on the right, which is, I guess, stay by yourself, and don't do this on the right. So there are a couple of things that we could talk about for the image on the right that are tricky. But basically just try and do one thing at one time and keep things as simple and straightforward as possible. I don't know if you have noticed, but several of the last examples that we have been talking about have used captions. And our visual tip number 6 is to use clear captions and titles. In this case, this example, it's the same image. It's an image of a baby with, it looks like an adult's finger covered in something moving about in their mouth, right? So on the right, it said keeping teeth healthy. That may generally be the topic for the health material you might find this visual in, but it's not very specific in terms of helping us understand actually how to do that. And it seems to a certain degree like it might be very disconnected from the actual image itself. Whereas the caption on the left, it clearly states that you take an action, you clean your baby's teeth with a clean soft cloth or a baby toothbrush. And in this case, it looks like this would be a clean soft cloth. So the image itself, sometimes you really need the caption to give your audience the information they need in order to have the visual aid actually support the main message. One of the things we're looking at in the current study we're doing with the National Library of Medicine is what kind of photos do or don't need photographs, or excuse me, captions. And sometimes there may be pictures that you include, especially images that are intended to help represent the target, the key audience, where you might not need a caption. But whenever you do use a caption, ideally you will use it to explain the image and relate it back to the main message of the health material. That would be ideal. Before I move on to the last image, I want to talk about a comment here. Somebody was talking about the diagonal slash above here. That can also mean negation. Yeah. And actually, I know that there was a presentation yesterday, and they were talking about some visual things to do, things to avoid. And one of them was avoiding the practice of crossing out things you don't want. And one of those is because we're used to them, but they're not actually super intuitive for all audiences. So that the slash can be very confusing for folks. Visual aid tip number 7. When you're representing people, actually show people. I think you'll notice these and recognize them as examples of kind of updates from hospitals as to who their patients are and what different kind of health they're in. So the critical care on the left, patients on ventilators on the right, and then we have vaccinated versus unvaccinated. On the right, we have dots, and dots are not necessarily a bad way of counting things. However, if I just look at the dots, I don't know what they're counting. Whereas on the left, I see a person figure and I know, okay, that's a person that they're counting. And so I'm able to basically get the effect of the dots, but it more easily conveys to someone that we're talking about people here and not cases, not counts, things along those lines. It makes it feel more human and relevant and applicable. This is a really good example in these day and ages. We've seen lots of these. The other thing I wanted to talk about here is just being careful about the color choices you use. One thing that immediately comes to mind when I look at the version on the right is the red, blue, false kind of polarization that we have in this country comes to mind. Now, whenever I see red and blue together, that's one of the things that comes to mind. And right now, that can be a tricky line to walk when you're trying to convey health information, and you don't want to add anything that could disrupt your message and get in the way there. Finally, visual aid tip number 8. And yes, color blindness may affect interpretation too. Thank you. Here is another place where color blindness can impact how useful a visual aid is. I saw a lot of questions about data visualization, infographics, how to represent statistics. And my background is actually in statistics. My specialty is quantitative research methodology. And that's one of the things I'm really interested in watching in the health literacy community is really just the fact that you're not going to find one particular type of graphic that is going to work all the time. You're not going to find a color scheme that is going to work all the time. That you really need to think through how your particular audience for this particular topic, for this particular number, are going to what's appropriate. So here it says avoid a one-size-fits-all approach. So this is the exact same information depicted in 2 different ways. On the left, we have one that captures kind of the relationship between the data points that it adds up to way more than 100%, and it shows the progression over time. So I've seen charts like the one on the right where people are like, great, I love pie charts. Everybody loves pie charts. I'll just stick this into a pie chart. First of all, if you're going to use a pie chart, the data should add up to 100% or rounding, 99%, 101 with a note. So that's thing number 1. Thing number 2, the colors are hard to distinguish here. Thing number 3 is it's really hard to convey the relationship between each slice. We have the legend over to the right, but it too, it puts them all in order, which is great, but it doesn't convey that one comes after another in terms of over a linear span of time. So going left to right helps with that. Yeah.
Are you seeing the pings? It looks like we have to wrap up. There's another session starting in 10 minutes.
Yes, there's so much more that we could talk to you all about. And I do want to go ahead and we will pass along the handout with some of our tips for the visual aids. I'm really sorry we didn't get to that. And we will also follow up with some additional resources that we have to get at some of the questions you have about where we can go for visual aid kind of pictures, some databases that we know about, and some helpful tips that we have from Communicate Health. So my last word is the best thing to do is use assessment tools to try and get a more objective sense of any materials you've developed. And then test with your audience. They are the ones who are the experts and will help you understand what's working and what's not working. I think that's it for today, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you so much, everyone. I put my email in the chat, and I think on the conference website, you'll find our handouts. We'll make sure they're all there. So if you have questions, send us an email. Thank you.